Hi, everyone. It's Lauren Sherman again, BoF's executive editor in New York. I am so happy to see you. Welcome to today's BoF Professional Digital Live event. Today, we're talking about fashion's supply chain disruptions, what you need to know. And I'm here with two of our esteemed editorial team, Sarah Kent, who is our sustainability correspondent, but she really covers all matter of corporate responsibility for BoF, and Brian Baskin, our senior news and features editor, who is Sarah's boss and my boss too, every single day. I'm so glad to be here with you guys. This is such an important topic, and we're going to get started really, really soon. But wanted to first just give the audience, thank you all for being here. There's already so many of you signed on. It's crazy. The number just keeps going up on the Zoom chat. But I wanted to give you guys a kind of a rundown of how this all works with Zoom. So you can ask us questions over the course of the conversation, and at the end of the conversation, we're going to save tons of time for that. If you'd like to write us a question, click the Q&A button in the bottom toolbar, not the chat button. I know the chat button makes you want to chat, but you really need to click the Q&A button and we'll be able to see your questions through that. If you do agree to ask us questions live, you need to turn on your webcam and audio when you are invited. There's a little bit of time between when we invite you and when you kind of come up to the panel and you're able to talk to us, but it will definitely work. You need some further help, Simon from our team is available. Hi, Simon. He's available via email on events@businessoffashion.com. So again, if you're having any trouble with this stuff, I know it can be a little tricky, events@businessofffashion.com. So now we're going to get started. This is, again, such a huge, huge topic. Sarah did an amazing story this week about it. And, you know, our readership really responded. And I think to start, it'd be good to hear from both of you. Brian, you've covered supply chain and logistics for quite some time, right? Before you joined us, you were at the Wall Street Journal and you were running a whole channel about it. And I think from both of you, and Sarah, you have been covering this for you know, quite some time as well. What are kind of the fundamental issues in the fashion supply chain that have been amplified by what has happened in the past 2 months with the pandemic? Brian, maybe do you want to start?
Sure. So just for a bit of context, before I joined BoF, I was a reporter and editor at the Wall Street Journal, and my beats were things like oil and other commodities. And then later I launched the Logistics Report, which was basically a news service aimed at logistics and supply chain professionals. And so what's happening right now and the topic we're discussing today was basically my life before I started covering fashion, and I was even covering it in 2008 and 2009, the last time we were sort of in this kind of crisis mode. And I guess just to jump right in, I mean, if I learned one thing about this topic, it's that when there's a crisis, whether it's a global crisis or just one at your company involving supply chain, we all become supply chain experts. Things like, you know, how stuff gets from point A to point B, where it's made. These are things that we basically take for granted unless it's literally your job as the logistics expert at your company to handle this sort of thing. But when they start to go wrong, you realize that when you have the global supply chain, there are many, many individual links, and you really need to be on top of all of them. And that's especially true when in something like this, where literally anything could go wrong and probably is going wrong at any point in the process. So I'd say just in terms of what fashion needs to be doing to address this, you know, sort of in general, it's constant communication with everyone you can think of who's involved in getting your products made and then transported to their final destination. And I'm sure we'll get more into this later, but I'll let Sarah pick up from here.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that unless you're the person really on top of this, you don't necessarily know the ins and outs of it. And Lauren, you were saying, what has this revealed about the supply chain? I mean, what it's revealed is that fashion supply chain in particular is really messy. And whilst from a consumer, even from a retailer's point of view, it might feel very smooth, the journey from design to store. Actually, there are many, many different things that go into it. And if you have a single blind spot, that could derail your entire supply chain in a crisis like this. So for instance, when this whole thing first started blowing up in China, the initial problem that fashion supply chain had was that components weren't arriving from factories in China to factories elsewhere in the world. And it could be something as simple as a hang tag or a zipper wasn't arriving. But that was derailing the entire supply chain, and brands that didn't have a very good handle on where they were getting stuff from were kind of blindsided by that.
What's happening in China now? Like, what have the last 2 months, because now we're looking at China and saying, is this what's to come in the West? In many different areas of the business, we're kind of using them as to inform how we make decisions here in the West. What have the last 2 months of the supply chain looked like in China, and where are they now comparatively?
I'll ask the question and then also say why it's not necessarily going to be a template for the rest of the industry. So China was pretty organized in its shutdown. It mandated, early on, really around Chinese New Year, that very tight social controls, and a lot of factories went on extended shutdown. And even when they could reopen, it took them a while to get back up to full manufacturing capacity because many of their employees and workers were still stuck wherever they'd gone home to for Chinese New Year and hadn't made it back. Now most of them are back up and operating. They're operating in a slightly often reduced capacity because they've introduced social distancing measures to ensure employees' safety as the country still is cautious about the disease reemerging. But they are back up and functioning more or less. The issue is that the conversation has shifted dramatically from where we were a month ago, where really when we were talking about the shutdown in China, the focus was on how it was going to impact consumer demand, because China is a big consumer. And we weren't really talking about the supply chain side of things because it was hidden. Now, as Western markets have shut down, the bottom's just fallen out of demand. So even if manufacturing countries come out of lockdown and are in a position for factories that have been shut to start operating again, it's not clear that the demand is going to be there anyway. So that's a new challenge coming into play.
And that's causing a lot of brands are not paying their factories, right? So even if these factories there are still a lot of factories up and running. I just spoke with a designer in Spain today, and she's a knitwear designer, and so she has a small factory in Barcelona, and then also her distribution center is in the factory. So she has like a few people still working, and they have a very specific setup to protect those people or what have you. It's still happening. She's still able to produce and distribute. But what we're hearing more of, and I think this has been part of your reporting, is that a lot of brands are just refusing to pay their factories because the product that the factories have made, the retailers that bought it from the brands aren't taking it. So they just don't want the product. They don't want to pay for it. What's happening there, and is that happening in all corners of the world?
I mean, not uniformly. As you said, different companies are responding differently. Different manufacturers are in a stronger or weaker position. But yeah, basically in the last 2 weeks, most companies faced with their retail network having to largely shut down have panicked and have hit the pause button or canceled orders. Often refusing to pay for orders that have already been produced. And this is really, really challenging for manufacturers who front the cost of production and the textiles they use. So they're on the hook for money they've already spent, being told that they're not going to receive payment. And Brian, I don't know if this reflects what happened in 2008.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's going to ripple up through the entire supply chain. So, a lot of factories, and this is true even for, like cotton farmers as well, they're using whatever they sell this season or this crop to pay for the next crop or the next round of production. So if a brand cancels an order or they just don't have any business, but they've already ordered their supplies, they, like a small factory might just, or a large factory, complex of factories could just go out of business or not have the capital to start up again when demand materializes. So it's going to make it much harder to recover. This idea of this V-shaped recovery that we've seen, to some extent in China isn't going to be possible everywhere.
Yeah, this is just moving really far upstream, right? So the person I was talking to today said that their dye factory, their textile and yarn they're able to get, but the dye factory is totally shut down at this point, and it's just stopping everything.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest message that I was hoping that we could get across with Sarah's stories today and yesterday about the garment industry is just that what you're seeing when you go out, on your block in New York or London or Paris or wherever you are, and you see closed stores, the same thing is happening in these places you never go, like factory districts in Bangladesh, or dye factories and tanneries, or cotton farms in Alabama. Like you're just seeing this exact same thing play out in much less visible places.
And there is a very, very large human cost to all of this. I mean, there are many human costs to this. Sarah, can you speak a bit about, what's happening in places like Bangladesh where, for years we've been talking about these employees in factories being mistreated and unfairly, and now they're just being completely put out of work, right? So what is happening in places like that where the people who are working in the factories, they need the jobs, but they are also, it just seems really murky and complicated.
Well, so there's two aspects to this. The first is that as the crisis hit, Western markets and brands started canceling and delaying orders. Factories started laying off people without pay to begin with. So in the same way as here in the US, retail workers are getting laid off, that's happening to garment workers around the world, many of whom, that they don't have savings to fall back on. They're often the sole wage earners for their family. They have many dependents, and they're being left without jobs, without pay in countries with very little social safety net. So that's one thing that was already happening a few weeks ago. And now, in addition to that, many of the manufacturing hubs for fashion are also beginning to see cases of the infection rise themselves. So India's gone into a very strict lockdown. Bangladesh is on lockdown. Pakistan is on lockdown, among others. Italy obviously is on lockdown. But in countries like India and Bangladesh, people can't really afford to self-isolate. They also don't necessarily live in places that where they can self-isolate. So if factories do open up again, many of them will go back to work. Factories are not necessarily set up to allow for people to socially distance or maintain the protections that would allow you to sort of avoid infection where possible. And particularly in India at the moment, you're seeing a crisis spread where millions of migrant workers, or hundreds of thousands of migrant workers, not all of them in the garment industry, have been trapped by the lockdown far from the regions where they are from, unable to claim government rations because you can't, in many cases, claim rations if you're not in your home region. Often thrown out of the place where they were living because it was linked to the place where they worked, which is now shut. So you're having this mass human migration on foot because public transport isn't happening across the country, and it's causing, it's a really big human tragedy right now. It's awful.
And this is something where I think brands, especially Western brands that have been relying on, cheap cheap labor, like cheap production in these countries. They really need to be hyper vigilant at this time about how the factories that they hire are treating workers. They need to notice when the things that Sarah just described are happening, and maybe consider not using those partners or applying pressure on these partners and saying, look, if you're going to treat workers this way, I know times are tough, like we can't, we're not going to work with you again, or even offering aid if that's possible, to say, here's we'll help cover these wages so you don't have to send everyone home with no benefits, or we'll cover unemployment benefits.
And it's not just the low end brands though as well. Like,
Totally.
There are artisan workers in India. The New York Times done great coverage on this, who do haute couture embroidery for the luxury brands. Many of the higher end brands do manufacture in factories in these countries. This is not just a fast fashion problem.
No, many of them manufacture in these countries and then they send the product to Italy or France to be assembled, so you can say it was made there, which I'm sure many of you on the call already know. But here's a question, how are factories protecting workers? What are the responsible factories doing? Do you have any examples of companies that have, taken the steps to ensure that their workers are protected during this?
So I think it's similar to what brands and retailers are doing in Western markets, where they can, where factories have to shut down, they're guaranteeing pay. Where they continue to operate, they're putting in place additional measures to make sanitation better. So, giving people masks and gloves, going down to half shifts or split shifts so that people can social distance within the factory, closing canteens or areas where people would congregate. So it's steps like that. The problem is, just as with here, the extent to which you can continue to protect your workers depends on the size of your balance sheet, and because of the way the manufacturing or supply industry works, as we were discussing earlier, where manufacturers front the cost of production, many of them, if they're not getting money in, they have a big cash flow issue right now.
And that's why it's good that Zara and H&M, as Sarah noted in today's story about garment workers, are still paying for existing orders at least, and that's not something that even a lot of companies of close to their size are doing. And so those factories are going to at least have that last set of payments that they can start planning, and it's not just having the rug pulled out from under them.
Yeah, I think that the biggest lesson any of us have learned, or the two words that we've used the most in the last 2 weeks, is cash flow. Fashion has a cash flow problem, a really big one on a lot of levels. I also wanted to talk to you guys about logistics and, getting product from factories to stores, or getting product from factories to distribution centers or e-commerce warehouses. I just mentioned this designer in Spain whose factory is its distribution center, but that's a small brand. That's not usually the case. Brian, can you talk a little bit about how that's all working right now? I'm assuming that it's getting tougher and tougher for non-essential goods to be shipped out.
That's exactly right. So I guess I'll highlight a really obscure link in the supply chain called freight forwarding. And this is not a term I was familiar with until I had to cover this for a living, but it's basically these giant companies like the size of a Chanel, or even a Kering in some cases, that all they do is basically arrange for large companies to get their goods from point A to point B. So they're the ones hiring the shipping companies and the air cargo and working with the customs officers. And some of the largest and most sophisticated of these companies in the last couple of weeks have they've declared force majeure, which basically means they threw up their hands and said, like, we're going to try our best, but we may not be able to actually do what we promised and get your shirts from Bangladesh to New York, or your shoes, from China to Italy. And that's unusual. You usually see that in a natural disaster, which I guess is what we're kind of in the middle of right now. And so what that basically means is we don't know how many ships and planes and trucks will be available. Will they be going on the same routes that they've always been on and that fashion brands have been counting on, for years? We don't know, will there be enough customs agents at the ports to process anything that's coming in? We don't know if the ports will be open next week. So can you really send a ship across the world? You don't know if it'll have a destination. There's all these questions, and still so early in this crisis that we really, and it's moving so fast that we don't have a lot of answers right now. And that's why I said that before, that communication is so key. You have to be talking to your freight forwarder, talking to your shipping companies every day and saying, okay, what's it look like today? Like, where are the problem spots? Should we consider rerouting some of our goods to a different port? What can we do? You have to be hyper vigilant about that, or you could really get caught by surprise.
Yeah, so I know it's really hard to talk forward and to think ahead right now because everything is so day by day. But one thing we've been writing a lot about and talking about within BoF is this idea of skipping a season, or just and what season that is, I think, is up to the brand, but essentially like not ordering product for fall or pre-fall if you were late on your orders anyway, or maybe even pre-spring resort, because you're going to have so much pretty much every brand is going to have a glut of inventory at the end of the season, unless you were making product on demand. But I think that's 1 out of a million brands were doing that. So essentially, how long is this going to last? Like, should we start thinking about orders for delivery in autumn now? I mean, I assume they're already doing that, but should people even be planning orders for autumn? If so, is that a way to like keep in the good graces of your manufacturer if you're able to give them a little bit of money right now for those orders? Thinking for the next season, what should brands be doing?
I'll start on this one, I guess. I think it is very hard to plan right now, as for some of the reasons you just outlined. I think you do have to start, because we don't know when this will end. We don't know when stores will reopen. We don't know if people will buy at the same levels once those stores do reopen. I think you have to plan, to resume something resembling normal operations, probably later this year. You also have to just assume you're going to have that inventory overhang and just sort of bite the bullet and shift it to off price, or that you're going to have to hold some sales and just get rid of that stuff. But I think the one thing you can do right now is really make sure that your data that you're collecting is as good as it can be. So if you at least know the scope of the problem, and you can really drill into where customer demand is and isn't right now, that's going to help you make these decisions later on, and it might give you a little bit of breathing room to do some of this.
Is there an argument for shifting your manufacturing to a different country right now? Because there are a lot of people who manufacture in Italy but could manufacture in Portugal if they needed to, or they manufacture certain things in China that are really super high quality, but right now it would make more sense to move that to Italy because they're a European-based country or what have you. I mean, one thing I've been thinking a lot about is localized manufacturing, and whether or not the companies that have more localized manufacturing are better positioned right now because they can produce inventory more quickly. Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that in particular?
I think that is not I think that is going to become a very, very relevant question. But right now, people are more focusing on not making things and trying to figure out like what they do with all the stuff they already have. So that has not come to the fore yet. How much of a part of a conversation that becomes as we move into the recovery phase of this crisis, I think will depend a lot on how lumpy that is and where it takes place. So if we all globally start to emerge at about the same pace, start to see infections decline at a similar rate because we're all going to lockdowns now, and things return to normal, then maybe there's not a huge incentive for people to massively change their supply chains. If it's lumpy, which seems likely, and some countries remain under lockdown for longer, then of course people are going to try and look at ways to change things around. And I think one thing that a lot of people are looking at more than, I mean, localization is part of this, but it's more just extreme flexibility and being able to maneuver in order to manage disruptions in the future. I had an interesting conversation with someone last week, actually, who was talking about how even at the design phase, people should be thinking, let me not just design this with one material in mind. Let me design it thinking about, numerous iterations of this product, so that if I can't get exactly what I want, there are ways for me to very quickly pivot
and this
to accommodate that.
Yeah, and this is going to reinforce a trend that we were already seeing well before this, which is diversifying where you produce your goods. So, 10 years ago, it was just like China, A to Z. And, over time, and then more recently, especially with the trade war last year, you saw a lot of big brands start to, put a little bit in Bangladesh and a little bit in Vietnam, and maybe bring a little bit back to their home country. And just like Sarah said, have that flexibility. So that doesn't necessarily help in a global pandemic when everything is shut down, but it will give you the opportunity. Let's say things improve in Bangladesh a little earlier than they do in India. You'll already have the factory contacts there because you've already been producing some of your goods there instead of having all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So we are going to open this up to the floor really soon because we have tons of questions, and thank you all for participating. It's so fun to see so many of you on here. But one final thing I wanted to ask you, in terms of other long-term implications, how else do you think this could reshape reshape the supply chain? I almost said supply chain. Do you think, I mean, one thing, I'm obsessed with like zero inventory and speed to market and all that stuff. Do you think any of that's going to get pushed forward? Are there any other implications? Could we see a shift back to China? I think there were some tariffs that were lifted yesterday, potentially. I don't want to misspeak, but what do you think is going to happen long term? And am I going to get my wish that people are going to try to get down to zero inventory at some point?
I mean, it took almost a decade after the financial crisis to start to get rid of that inventory overhang that developed. And I would imagine, I would hope the industry had maybe learned some techniques to shorten that period this time. I think it's inevitable. We're probably gonna have a few years of that cycle of discounts and, just like warehouses full of stuff. Like, that's just gonna be hard to avoid. But like, I do think there have been some lessons learned that should allow that period to it shouldn't take a decade this time.
Sarah, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think we're definitely going to see a lot of consolidation. Not everyone's coming out of this, which to your point about where manufacturing hubs could be at the end of this, how that happens could dictate that a lot. I think near term, you will see people moving back to China because it is open right now. I don't know how that will play out long term, depending on what happens with tariffs or what happens elsewhere. I think there is an opportunity to move towards many better practices to try and create mechanisms that will protect manufacturers and garment workers down the line, and also to reduce the waste and inventory overhang within the industry, get smarter, be more digital. That opportunity exists. I don't know whether within the kind of crazy panic mode everyone is in right now, the industry will be well placed to take advantage of it, or whether it will fall back as many companies seem to have done so far on the old playbook of, sort of scorched earth, cancel, pause everything, and recoup internally.
Well, one last thing I'll cover really quickly that could also change long term is raw materials costs are going to have a huge influence over fashion in the coming years. So what we've seen recently is cotton prices and oil prices have both plunged to to decade lows. And this also happened in the financial crisis. And what you saw back then is people didn't plant enough cotton to meet demand when it came back. And then cotton prices went to record highs. And this really squeezed a lot of, especially low end fashion brands because their margins were so thin. And what it also led to is a much greater use of synthetic materials because oil prices stayed low and cotton prices went very high. And that, in a way, you could almost like credit like the rise of athleisure and activewear to the financial crisis in that sense and what was going on in commodities markets. And I think we'll see something similar happen again here.
So
just blew my mind, Brian. So the first person we have is Emily, just get her surname. Emily Sandberg, who is calling from London, I believe, or the UK. Emily, would you like to join the panel?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you so much for being here. Do you want to show your face? You don't have to, but right now it's just your voice.
Yeah, no, sure, I can do that. There we go. Hi.
Great.
Hey, hi.
I'm Emily Sandberg. I have a independent sneaker brand in London called Roscommar. And I mean, for us, I think there's massive implications now happening as many retailers are closing down their orders, current orders and future orders for autumn, winter and spring, summer 21. So I'm really curious to know like how you see that seasonality might actually adapt around the sort of supply chains for the rest of this year. If in the footwear industry, traditionally, there's 2 buying seasons. And if that's something that retailers might start to consider to maybe chop up a little bit, because the background to this is, of course, as a small brand, we only produce twice per year. So if we don't get to do like a full minimum order quantity cycle, then how is that potentially affecting buying?
I think actually Lauren might be best positioned to answer that, but I will start by just noting that when I've been reading, you know, like other publications when they've been talking about supply chain, a lot of them keep coming back to Nike and how they're actually pretty well positioned to weather something like this because they're not so tied to seasons. They have a lot of drops, like they have a lot of, you know, they sort of like just sort of produce when they need it for who needs it. And I think a lot of businesses, like if they're able to adapt to that cycle, and a lot of that does depend on the retailers, obviously, if they're able to adapt to that cycle, they're going to be in a better position than if they were wholly reliant on, you know, spring, summer and following the regular fashion cycles.
Yeah, I think Brian's exactly right. We've seen the fashion industry move further and further into this drops driven or just smaller collections. Maybe you only present twice a year, but then those collections are broken up into, I mean, once a month drops within the year so that you can just kind of develop and a bit at a time and then produce a bit at a time. I think what that will require is different types of manufacturing. So when you go to your manufacturers and you don't have as many units there, you can still get the unit economics that you need. So I think that that's something that will have to change. But yeah, I mean, in terms of fashion itself, that shift has already been happening. It was already in the contemporary world, there were always monthly drops. In high fashion, it was much more seasonal and only broken into 4. I think it will just continue to be more and more increasingly divided, but what that will require is sophistication on the manufacturing side of the, not only from the brands not placing as big of orders, but being able to turn around that product quickly. So it will require more speed to market. Nike has done a lot of this, and they actually tried something a couple years ago in the US where they worked with this company called Flex, which manufactures a lot of products for Apple, I believe, and they were making a certain style of shoe in the US and doing all the Nike ID as well. They dissolved that partnership, and I did do a story on it. If you look it up, it's about Nike's direct to consumer strategy. To be honest, it was 2 years ago. I don't remember exactly why they did. They moved, but they only moved that manufacturing to Mexico, which is very close to the US. So a lot of this has to do with, you know, changing the way the manufacturers work as well in terms of how many units they require, that sort of thing. But for sneakers and things, yeah, for sure. I think people want a couple new, you see this drip feed of product, and you see what the way a lot of the direct to consumer brands develop things, and they don't have that much on their website. They just like release one new thing a week or whatever. And I think you're going to see more companies operating in that way, because consumers don't buy a bunch of stuff at the beginning of the season and then wait until the next season. They buy a little bit at a time. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think that the challenge for us, I mean, you know, a brand the size of Nike can sort of actually have the privilege to kind of actually produce one range and make only that drop. I think that's a challenge, I think, for independent brands, because even if you have a drop sort of model, it doesn't necessarily mean that those products are produced to that drop. They are more they're more likely produced in one batch and then sort of sold in drops, etc.
Where do you manufacture?
In Vietnam. So this is why we as a brand have higher MOQs than if we were to produce in Europe, for instance.
Yeah, so I think that's the trick. I think that there are going to have to be more, manufacturers are going to have to be more flexible about how many units are produced and how they, I think brands are going to have to do a lot of research. I know it's really hard, especially with shoes, to find a factory that is good quality that you like working with. And so, but I do think a lot of these factories, I know in Italy, there are a lot of factories that are so desperate for work that they're willing to work with brands on smaller unit runs. But I think it's going to be a lot of negotiating and a lot of back and forth. And also the factories that are able to do this kind of smaller units and quick turnaround and things will become more successful. So, but it's going to take a lot of work back and forth. Brian, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it like good news, but like in a recession, like when large factories have orders canceled, a lot of them do look to open up some of their production to smaller brands than they would have worked with otherwise. So there will be opportunities, more opportunities than you see now, to do smaller production runs and get factories to sort of work more on your terms than trying to dictate to you. Because I do know, like you said, like for smaller brands, it is so hard to get anyone to do anything beyond just like a set production run at, you know, very large amounts.
Thank you so much, Emily, and good luck to you.
Thanks.
Next up, we have Rajat from India. Very exciting. We never have anyone from the US though. I don't know why. Yeah, it's so complicated because everybody, you know, there's so much pressure to. Hi, Rajat.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hello. Yes. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing? Nice to hear all the comments.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So I'm in Kolkata and I'm running a fashion production business, and we do mainly hand embroideries, and we work with some creative designers, and we also work with some American companies. So I know this is a year which we all would like to delete, you know, 2020. And but my main concern is that if we come out of this with minimum of losses, because there are going to be losses, which I'm mentally prepared. But I mean, the losses should be limited to the extent that we survive and we go to better times in the future. So what I'm requesting here is that, I mean, we get our orders all from the Western world, of course. And so we have raw materials bought and we have goods produced. So they should not be canceled, you know, they should not be panic, you know. Okay, everything is going to open again. We all will need clothes. We all will go to shop. But there should be some mechanism thought over with the big guys there, like, you know, okay, why not we work a strategy so our supply chains are not killed, you know, because I know that a lot of businesses will go bankrupt, you know, if this is the scenario. A lot of businesses going to go bankrupt in Bangladesh, India, I think Vietnam, I'm not sure. So there should be some kind of a strategy. Earlier, I heard that H&M had cancelled the orders, but now they will take them. And so did Inditex announce it today, like some of the other groups have announced. So there should be a mechanism worked out. So we still get to see these small businesses survive and they look forward to another year, which could be rewarding, you know. So that is why my main concern is, you know.
So there are efforts underway to try and convene the stakeholders around this. So the brands, manufacturers, intergovernmental organizations, development banks that could provide funding to try and come up with this kind of mechanism, which obviously would be great. The challenge is that getting so many people around a table and reaching agreement on something this complex is challenging at the best of times, let alone when you're trying to do it in the midst of a global financial meltdown and via Zoom. So I know that there are early stages of talks to try and build these kind of mechanisms that you're talking about, but they're early stages. And I also think you raise a really good point about stuff that's being produced or that is in manufacture now and that should not go to waste. And I think that is an opportunity for brands and manufacturers that are able to collaborate, that are able to work together now to find ways to use the stuff that's already there, which will be really helpful as we start to see a recovery when everyone's cash strapped, you know, not having to go out and source everything from scratch.
Yeah, I mean, see, we have labor, we are paying wages, and we have to continue because of our laws, and so there's no escaping that, and we have social responsibility as well. So similarly, we also, and you know, we have to be compliant, but what about our buyers? Why aren't they compliant? Why aren't they in the balance sheet? They should have some fund which should be like in a separate escrow account, that if they are ordering so much, what happens if something happens?
You're just breaking up a little bit, but I think you raise a really good point, and I think that what this crisis is exposing, which is something that has been an ongoing conversation, but perhaps not having as much prominence as it should have done, is the imbalance of power within the supply chain, is the fact that, you know, the brands wield a lot of the financial power and also take a very large amount of the profits, and there aren't these protections in place. And you know, hopefully this is an opportunity to redress some of that. I'm sorry, we lost you.
Yeah, I lost you guys. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, some of the guys are exposed now because if they didn't have the means, they ordered, and now they can't even pay a deposit. I mean, a percentage of it. So, as a, you know, the compliance in the future, they should be having enough money in their balance sheet, which should be earmarked, and it should be kept in a, even if they don't want to pay the factory, at least it should be in a separate escrow account in their country, orders in case something goes wrong, you know. So you just don't hear from them, oh, we have ordered all, we have cancelled all the orders. You know, this simple email, like automated email comes, and which is a nightmare, you know. Well, I mean, I can't tell my labor tomorrow, okay, this is the email. I have to just, you know, 3 months, 6 months, that's about it. And then how I continue. So I would say that we should minimize the losses and move on. Everybody has to become a positive frame of mind, you know. That's what my thinking is.
Rajat, you made some really, really good points. Thank you so much. We have to move on now to Anna Maria. Thank you again, and we'll be addressing those in our reporting. We're moving on to Anna Maria in Colombia. We'll be joining any minute. Yeah, it's so complicated in this circumstance, because everyone is affected. No one is, I mean, I'm sure there are a few businesses that are benefiting from this terrible thing, but no one in the apparel industry. Hi, Anna Maria, how are you?
Hi, how are you? It's great to say hello to you from Colombia. Thank you very much for all your very interesting insight. So I'm the owner of a brand here in Colombia, emerging brand. So I guess my concern for us, like the small businesses, in terms of the downstream in the industry, because we currently produce in-house. So on that side, we've been able to have a little more control over our production. So I think that I can expect the short and the long-term effects to be for emerging brands in terms of taking over market share on a local level from the traditional global brands. And I guess, what do you consider would be key for us emerging brands, small business owners, to keep in mind moving forward with the disruption in raw material and supply?
I can take a stab at this, and maybe Brian or Sarah, you could talk a bit about the raw material part. But I'd say there are two things happening here. Sarah mentioned consolidation before. This is going to be a circumstance where the really big players, we've already been seeing this in the last 10 years, that the big players in luxury really own that market, and they own the fashion market, they own the accessories market. And if you are not part of one of those strategic groups, it's really, really hard to break through and become a big business. That being said, it's still possible to maintain a small business if that's what your ambitions are. And that's, if you want to become really, really big, it's going to be harder than ever to do that. If you want to have a business where you sell to a very devoted number of customers, that's still going to be possible. It's, again, still going to be harder because the big groups, they own every single part of the market. They own the floor space at the department stores, they own the supply chain, they own materials, all of that stuff. And so I'd say it's going to be harder than ever in that way. But at the same time, I think that there are so many amazing companies that came out of the last recession, and any time of crisis, if you are creative and can think of a new way of doing things. One of the reasons fashion is so stuck and why so much of this happened is that they didn't figure out how to do things in a new way. And if you're a person who wants to try to do that, there is a lot of opportunity. I think also you mentioned local. I do think there is an opportunity for local commerce, and we're going to see a lot less tourism shopping in the next year at least. And so there is an opportunity to connect with people one-on-one or connect with people via Instagram. I think that there is hope for independent brands, but in the US, I don't know what it's like in Colombia, but a lot of these brands are in a ton of debt. And that's another part of it. You need to be as conservative as possible and maintain your spending, because or really be careful about it, because that's the issue here. Like, so many of these brands are going to fail because they're in debt right now, and if they weren't in debt, maybe they would be able to get through this. So I do think that there's hope and opportunity, but it really depends on what your ambitions are. Brian and Sarah, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think in terms of downstream considerations, I think every brand, large or small, needs to be thinking about the e-commerce versus brick and mortar models. I think how people shop is going to be one of those things that we look back on in 5 years and say, oh, everything changed in 2020. And I don't think we know how yet, but I think whatever the rules were that were determining your mix of how you sold and how you reached customers, just assume they're going to change, and just be really closely monitoring that and really strategizing about how you want to reach your customers. And then you mentioned raw materials, and I think the reason I brought that up is not so much like, I don't think there's a lot that anyone can really do, in the short term. Certainly, if prices for things like cotton are going all over the place. But I think just being aware that these prices are changing rapidly, and knowing what share of your business is dependent on having access to cheap cotton or cheap synthetic fabrics is really important. I think a lot of people are sort of ignorant of how these markets work, and it's publicly available information. You can get up to speed on, okay, like, here's what's happening in the cotton futures market. That means my suppliers are probably going to come to me in 2 months and say, hey, all of our costs just went up 25%. We're passing that on to you. Like, just sort of knowing it's coming is sort of half the battle here.
Okay.
Anna Maria, thank you so much for being with us, and good luck. Send us your Instagram handle so we can check your line out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Next up, we have Uvgu from Turkey. Although this is affecting every single corner of this industry. It's really interesting to hear from so many different kinds of people.
Hello, could you hear me?
We can.
Hello.
Hello.
I hope all you are doing fine. Greetings from Turkey. I'm a material management engineer working for logistics department, automotive industry, and I can say that it's a great experience for me because we are talking all of the countries, especially for Europe, and there are lots of different regulations to import the goods right now. I can say it's really amazing that some people are really working, doing their best, but most of the companies are closing day by day, sadly. So my question is for the stock management. I really guess that how fashion industry overcome this overstock, because if they do discounts, some countries and some people even won't have to chance to buy these goods or these clothes. So is there a chance that they can re-evaluate this stock? They can, for an example, they can make new clothes from that stock? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen some people talking about converting unsold clothes into masks, or like sort of protective gear. Like, you're right, like there's so many other uses for this than just dumping it all at like a discount store or having a fire sale. I think there's so much out there that I don't think there's all the face masks in the world that could be made from just like a tiny fraction of the overstock out there. But I think you're right, like people have to think creatively about this for sure.
But I also think that it raises another really interesting question that was kind of in the mix before all of this went down, which is like, what do you do with your overstock? What do you do with your excess inventory? And I think there are sort of generally smaller, younger brands that are doing really interesting things, trying to give new life to things that didn't sell from a previous season, either sort of cutting them up and weaving them together, or doing other things with excess inventory or dead stock fabrics. I think that's harder for a bigger brand just because they operate within such a specific system that requires them to function in a way that doesn't really allow for that kind of creativity. But what they do with that stuff is very interesting because, obviously they can discount. Historically, they might have burned it. I don't think most of them can really do that anymore from a reputational standpoint. So we may be looking at an even greater volume of excess inventory than we even did in 2008, when brands had maybe other means for how to manage it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. I think we have time for one more question. Karn from Canada will be joining us. This was so great, guys. I really appreciate you taking the time, and it's amazing. This has definitely been the most people we've had on one of these, and so happy we have two experts on the team who can talk to this stuff.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I'm just trying to get the question up here. Here you are. Are you there?
We are.
Okay.
Thanks for being with us.
Hi, I'm a smaller brand from Canada, from Toronto. My name is Karn Good. And my question is that I've been dealing with a lot of fabric companies from Italy, and it's kind of crushed my business. I was just wondering, what do you see going forward? Do you see the industry producing more fast fashion, or is luxury still going to be relevant?
I mean, obviously, crystal ball gazing here, but I think in many ways, luxury may rebound faster because people who buy luxury goods are still going to want luxury goods that, you know, high net worth individuals probably will still have money at the end of this. Whereas people who shop more fast fashion, it may take them longer to come back to a point where they have money to spend on discretionary items. So I think from a consumer perspective, luxury may well be more resilient. From a manufacturing and perspective, I again think that because the very big luxury companies do have firepower, and they will ensure that the craftsmanship they need is sustained. You will see luxury manufacturers and textiles sustained. There probably will still be consolidation. Does that help? Brian, Lauren?
Yes, that was great. Very great to hear. And I just wanted to ask you, in terms of the sustainability, will we still plunge forward with that, or do you think we're going to take 10 steps back?
I just want to, yeah, Sarah can speak to that. I just want to jump in really quickly. I've done a lot of reporting on this. Mm-hmm. Generally, in the last recession, luxury took a harder hit. But as Sarah said, that like high net worth individuals are still high net worth individuals at the end of this. Typically, in the end, luxury, like 10 years on, luxury is way bigger than it was. The luxury industry, I've been doing a bunch of reporting around this, it didn't really exist in it. It's only existed in the last 20 years. So what Sarah said about the consolidation, there will be more, and you know, the supply chain will be protected by these big companies. But you will see in the next year, people being more careful about how they spend their money, and they might still spend it, but an analyst I talked to the other day said they'll buy Loro Piana cashmere instead of some like garish print or something. Mm-hmm. So you'll see kind of like that return. They're talking a lot about the return to quiet luxury. I think that's a little overblown, but I do think people are just going to be much more careful about what they're buying for the next couple of years. But luxury, you know, people didn't used to buy, like middle class people didn't buy luxury goods before 20 years ago. That wasn't a common thing. Whereas now you see kids who are saving up their money for Gucci sneakers or what have you. The culture's just changed so much. And Sarah can speak more to the sustainability point, but I think generally what this has done is it's just accelerated a lot of changes in consumer behavior that we were already expecting. So in terms of sustainability, do I think that most consumers really are like, I'm going to buy fewer things that are better because I don't want to hurt the environment? The majority of consumers pre this, I would say, no, they weren't. But now you may see that in the same way the last recession really pushed forward the organic food movement. I've been thinking about that a lot, and maybe this is the opportunity for fashion. But Sarah, you may have a different opinion or have more insight on that.
I think that's a good point. I think there's a lot of risks and a lot of opportunities around this. The risk being, if you look back to 2008, the last recession, there had actually been a lot of movement around sustainability running up to that point. The recession hit, that was out the window. I think the conversation is quite different now. As Lauren said, consumers are much more engaged with it. I also think that politically, the narrative around climate change and the urgency on that issue it will not recede just because we're in a massive immediate crisis. That's still a looming issue that we have to deal with. But so I think brands are going to have to grapple with the fact that they don't necessarily have the money to do some of the initiatives that they had said they were going to do, but at the same time, there's an expectation that they keep on with this. And so we'll probably see things slow down, but the conversation will remain. I think the other interesting opportunity here is that we've seen in a very short space of time focus shift hugely to social issues because of what's happening to people right now, getting laid off, not getting paid, etc. So where 3 weeks ago when we talked about sustainability in the fashion industry, oftentimes people were just talking about stuff they were doing around environmental stuff and they would ignore social issues. I think there's going to be an equalization there, and there's an opportunity to bring both of those up. But Brian, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'm also optimistic that sustainability is going to emerge stronger than ever from this crisis. I think the difference between now and 2008 is that sustainability is trendy. It's something people want to do regardless of whether it's cost effective or a government is requiring them to do it. You know, and I think that means it's got kind of a momentum of its own. And like Sarah said, it's something people are looking at even in the middle of it, all of this. They're looking at how are people treating unions? How are they treating people in developing countries who manufacture clothing? The fact that these conversations are happening at all is really encouraging because I don't think they were to the same extent the last time we were in a situation like this.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Thank
thank you again for taking the time. We really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who asked a question. Thank you to everyone who participated in this call. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Sarah and Brian, who are super smart and amazing. I love working with them. And thank you to the BoF team for putting this together. We have a bunch of other really good stuff happening this week. Tomorrow morning, you can do a boot camp with Akin Ackman at 8 a.m. Eastern. I will not be doing that, but I will be doing another one of these sessions, the new rules for going direct to consumer, which was written by one of our reporters, Javi Lever, and now she wrote it before all this happened. Now there's going to be lots of new rules, so please join in for that too. So thank you, everyone, and if you need me, tweet at me, tweet at Sarah, tweet at Brian, email us on, firstname.lastname@businessoffashion.com. And thanks, everyone. Have a really good day. Bye.